Chapter 28, The Age of Anxiety, and our years are 1900 to 1940. So we've already talked about World War I, so it looks like we're backtracking a little bit. But we're really looking at a different perspective here. We're looking at the culture of these years. We're looking at the mass consumption of these years, the ideas, the literature that came especially after World War I. And then we'll close this chapter with the Great Depression. Uncertainty in modern thought. Uncertainty being the key here. And you'll see this trend of people saying that nothing is certain, nothing is absolute, everything is subjective to the individual. So just keep that in mind as we go through these. But we're starting with modern philosophy. And so as the 19th century ended, there was a small group of thinkers and creative writers who confronted this Enlightenment belief in the ability of rational human beings to understand the universe through intellectual and scientific investigation. These critics, the most notable was Friedrich Nietzsche, and I'll spell his name for you, or Nietzsche at least. You probably wouldn't just come up with this. Friedrich, probably, since he's German, but Friedrich Nietzsche rejected the general faith in human progress and the rational human mind. And he wrote in a very provocative but poetic style. And his argument was that the West had overemphasized rationality and had stifled the passions and animalistic instincts that drive human activity and true creativity. And he even went on to question the values of Western society, arguing that reason and democracy and progress and even respectability were outworn social and psychological constructs whose influence was suffocating excellence and self-realization. So according to Nietzsche, the only hope for the individual was to accept the meaningless of life, accept the meaninglessness of the human existence, and then to make it a source of personal integrity, and only then would you find liberation. Nietzsche wasn't well read during his living years. His ideas attracted attention in the early 20th century and were fundamental in the rise of the philosophy of existentialism in the 20s. And you really see this whole meaninglessness of life perpetuated after World War I. And just for fun, here are some Nietzsche quotes. This one you've probably heard of, "That which does not kill us makes us stronger." That's Nietzsche. He also said, "You have your way, I have my way. As for the right way, the correct way, and the only way, it does not exist." And then one more. He said, "It is not a lack of love, but a lack of friendship that makes unhappy marriages," which that one really has nothing to do with what we're talking about. I just like it and agree with it. One of the few things I would agree with him about. The second philosopher was a French philosopher. He was Professor, probably Henri or Henry Bergson. And Bergson argued that immediate experience and intuition were every bit as important as rational and scientific thinking for understanding reality. His belief was that people had lessened the importance of intuition and personal experience and passion. And he said that it was every bit as valuable as rationality and scientific thinking. The First World War accelerated the revolt against established certainties in philosophy. And this is, it's like I was saying, there's uncertainty everywhere. Nothing is certain. Everything is subject to each person. Austrian philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein, probably V's because heavily influenced by the German language here. It may just be Wittgenstein, but I doubt it. Okay, so he argued in his Tractatus Logico Philosophicus, I think that's right, that the great philosophical issues of the ages, like the idea of God and freedom and morality and so on. He argued that all of that is a waste of time because neither scientific experiments nor mathematical logic could demonstrate their validity. God, morality, and freedom could not be defined in scientific or mathematical terms, so he believed it was pretty much useless. Existentialism sort of united the thinkers in a search for usable moral values in a time of anxiety and uncertainty. Many of them were atheists. Many of them didn't believe in a supreme being or a God, much less that he had established humanity's fundamental nature and had given life its meaning. French existentialist Jean-Paul Sartre said that, quote, existence precedes essence, end quote. And by that, he meant that there is no God-given timeless truth outside or independent of individual existence. Therefore, your truth is your truth and my truth is my truth. They did recognize that human beings should act in the world, and they believed that individuals needed to create their own meaning and to define themselves through their actions. So ironically, there was this powerful ethical component that put great stress on individual responsibility and choice on being in the world the, quote, right way. What that right way is, I don't know, since everyone in their eyes has their own right and wrong. So oddly, in the midst of all of this, there was a revival of Christianity in the decades after World War I. They were on the defensive from all of the Enlightenment ideas, but some theologians, especially Protestant ones, before 1914, had felt the need to interpret Christianity and the Bible so that it wouldn't contradict science, evolution, and common sense. And in these circles, Christ was primarily seen as a good moral teacher, and the miracles, the divinity, the spiritual aspects of Christ were played down. The revival of fundamental Christian belief after World War I was fed by the rediscovery of the work of a Danish theologian who had been writing in the 1800s, Søren Kierkegaard. And his stuff is really good. Actually, his name is hard to spell. But Søren Kierkegaard. And he rejected this notion that Christianity was just an empty practice. And one of his classic works, Sickness Unto Death, written in 1849, Kierkegaard suggested that people needed to take a leap of faith and to accept the existence of an objectively unknowable, but nonetheless awesome and majestic God. And then in the 20s, more people began to come forth and to write in this manner. One of them was the Swiss Protestant theologian Karl Barth. And he argued that human beings were imperfect. They were sinful creatures whose reason and will were hopelessly, or are hopelessly flawed. And really, religious truth is only made known to human beings through God's grace, not through reason or science. And then French existentialist Gabriel Marcel believed that Catholicism and religious belief provided the hope, the humanity, the honesty, and the piety for which him and the rest of the post-war broken world hungered. And interestingly, there was a whole list of intellectuals who were attracted to Christianity for the first time or converted to the religion because of these writers. T.S. Eliot, W.H. Auden, Aldous Huxley, C.S. Lewis, Carl Stern, Max Planck, just to name a few, but there were many who were attracted to the religion during this time. It's important to remember that there were still people during this time that believed that science was based on hard facts and controlled experiments. And an important first step toward the new physics was the discovery that atoms were actually composed of many far smaller, fast-moving particles like electrons and protons. And this is going to be a list of even more names, so I'm sorry about that. This is a name-heavy chapter, if that's possible. Marie Curie, she was a Polish-born physicist, and her French husband, Pierre, discovered that radium consistently emits subatomic particles. And the importance of that is that it means that radium does not have a constant atomic weight. It changes. German physicist Max Planck showed in 1900 that subatomic energy is emitted in uneven little spurts, which are called quanta. And they aren't emitted in a steady stream, which called into question the old distinction between matter and energy. And he is one of the fathers of quantum mechanics. And then in 1905, the German Jewish genius, Albert Einstein, further undermined Newtonian physics with his theory of special relativity. And in this, he said that the only constant, the only consistency for all frames of reference is the speed of light. Basically, everything else, time and space, are relative to the viewpoint of the observer. And an example of this would be like if you're at a birthday party, which is 2 hours long, and you're doing something enjoyable, it seems like maybe it's only been 30 minutes. If you're in a class that's 2 hours long and you're bored out of your mind, it feels like 4 hours. And so he was saying time and space are relative to the viewpoint of the observer. Another example would be when you're a little kid, your house seems huge, and then as you become adult and you get bigger, your house doesn't seem big anymore, which is kind of weird. Maybe you haven't experienced that yet, but I have, and it's really weird. But he argued that the only constant is the speed of light. Einstein also clearly stated in his theory that matter and energy are interchangeable, and this led to the construction of the atomic bomb later on. But breakthrough followed breakthrough. There were many during this time. In 1919, Ernest Rutherford showed that the atom could be split, and by 1944, 7 subatomic particles had been identified. The most important of those was the neutron. And although few people, most people are not scientists, so few people understood this revolution in physics, but the implications of these theories and discoveries as presented by popular writers and newspapers were disturbing to people in the 1920s and the 30s. In 1927, German physicist Werner Heisenberg formulated the uncertainty principle, and basically he said that nature itself is ultimately unknowable and unpredictable, and according to him, everything was relative. So, like modern philosophy, physics no longer provided comforting truths about natural laws or optimistic answers about humanity's place in an understandable world. And so even science was racked by uncertainty. So Freudian psychology. Sigmund Freud developed a very different viewpoint of the human psyche. And his ideas were based on the analysis of dreams and of the hysteria of his patients. But he concluded that human behavior was basically irrational and governed by the unconscious, which contained vital instinctual drives and powerful memories. So, of course, Freud was a psychologist. His therapy pretty much consisted of asking people what their dreams were. He would take things that they said on accident, they're called Freudian slips, and try to figure out what was going on in their unconscious. And Freud had these 3 structures of self, and they included the id. And the id is your completely irrational desires. So the id, if not balanced by the ego or the superego, would say, you know what? I want a donut right now. And they would get up, they would leave class, and they would go get a donut right now, no matter what was going on or who that might inconvenience. So if you were governed just by the id, this is just your raw desire. The second part of this structure is the superego. And the superego is the conscience or internalized voice of control, which Freud said this one was also irrational. It wants to do right, it tries to make good decisions, but ultimately the balance between these two comes from the ego. And the ego is your most conscious, rational self that negotiates between the id and the superego. And so this is like society's standards, what people expect of you, what they want you to do. And so your ego supposedly helps you make good decisions. But these are the three structures of what Freud believed was the human psyche. In 1930, Freud wrote Civilization and Its Discontents. And in it, he argued that civilization is only possible when people renounce their irrational instincts in order to live peaceably in groups. The only problem with this is renouncing your desires completely left your basic instincts unfulfilled, and so it led to widespread unhappiness. But this is Freud in a nutshell. So this general climate of pessimism and relativism and uncertainty also plays out in 20th century literature. And we're just going to go through a bunch of these. Don't feel like you have to write every one of them down. But French novelist Marcel Proust wrote In Remembrance of Things Past, and the whole thing was him recalling bittersweet memories of childhood and youthful love, and basically trying to discover their innermost meaning. You see Freud's influence in Jacob's Room as well by Virginia Woolf, which is made up of a series of internal monologues, basically someone talking to themselves, where Woolf tries to capture the inner voice in prose. William Faulkner was one of America's greatest 20th century novelists, used this technique as well in The Sound and the Fury. And this intense drama is sort of confusedly seen through the eyes of a mentally disabled man. And the most famous stream of consciousness novel is Ulysses, and this one was written by Irish novelist James Joyce, and he weaves in ironic parallel between his hero's wanderings through the streets of Dublin and the adventures of Homer's hero Ulysses. So he really abandons conventional plot altogether and just blends in foreign words and puns and random bits of knowledge and scraps of memory. Just really a confusing piece of writing. But the language is intended to mirror modern life itself, which he believed was a riddle waiting to be unraveled. The Decline of the West by Oswald Spengler and the famous poem The Wasteland by T.S. Eliot both depicted a world of growing desolation, and both expressed the widespread despair that followed the First World War. Writer Franz Kafka wrote The Metamorphosis, The Trial, and The Castle, and these just portrayed an incomprehensible, alienated world where helpless individuals are crushed by unexplainable hostile forces. And in these and many other works, our authors between the wars use literary techniques and dark imagery to portray this age of anxiety and uncertainty and pessimism. So we'll go ahead and bring this video to a close, and we'll pick up with modernism in architecture, art, and music in the next video.